And to live in the here. Remember, everything that happens to you happens in the now. And so the secret is to learn how to live here. And if God wants to get at us, He'll have an easier chance of it. We want to be all here now. All the parts we're afraid of, and the parts we fear and reject, deny. God loves all of us, not just parts. So loving God, we come to you for our own liberation, to serve as some kind of liberation for the world. We thank you for the freedom of the sons and daughters of God. We thank you for the freedom of the gospel. We pray with hope and gratitude in Jesus' name. So, as I said, today would be the counterpoint to the other lecture. I guess we got to begin almost by redeeming the title. The secular press, and I guess the right wing of the church too, did a real number on the very term liberation theology, at least in the American press, I suppose European too. The result being that most people think it's something that's condemned or passé or heretical or wrong. I was teaching it in Cincinnati in the early 80s in the cathedral basement, in fact. And we had a very secular Republican paper there in Cincinnati called the Cincinnati Enquirer. I remember this period in the early 80s after Reagan had been elected. And suddenly this very secular Republican paper seemed to have all kind of interest in theology, which was amazing to me. They never showed any interest before. And it was always to condemn it, right? To be on the front or second page, Pope condemns liberation theology. Pope calls liberation theology Marxist. Rome gives warnings against liberation theology. And when this document came out in 1984, in instruction on certain aspects of the theology of liberation, there were 11 warnings in here, which Rome loves to do, gives warnings. And actually, I had to agree with all of the warnings. Yeah, that would be an excess, that would be an excess. So I started actually teaching from this. But this was simply published in the quick presses, Pope warns against liberation theology. So this was 84. Then in 86, the Vatican put out a second document, Instruction on Christian Freedom and Liberation, in which, to the introduction to it, the Pope says, liberation theology is not only orthodox but necessary. So if you want to quote, I'd hold on to that. Liberation theology is not only orthodox but necessary. It was very interesting to me. The press that was obsessed with this document for 2 years, all right, when this document came out, there was not a mention. So it's so clear that we think we have a free press in the United States. You can only hear what you're ready to hear. You can only hear what you want to hear. Our inclination, our predisposition, is that anything supporting the poor or the bottom or questioning the system is naturally suspect. And liberation theology appeared to be doing that, which it clearly was. And so that we were quite anxious to pounce on. And once it was deemed, in fact, orthodox, we didn't want to hear anything more about it. But most people still will consider liberation theology something condemned or heretical. In 1980-81, right after Reagan was elected, a committee met up here in the city of Holy Faith, Santa Fe. They put out this document. It was embargoed until 1988. You couldn't even get it. And they were so embarrassed that they published it. Well, I don't think they were embarrassed, but they should have been embarrassed. These were the guidelines for the Reagan administration. And in this document, which they met up here in those months before he was actually inaugurated, they recommended that the U.S. government keep a careful eye on this developing liberation theology in Latin America, particularly at that time in what they thought was largely the Catholic Church, because they very likely will not support the foreign policy of the United States government. And of course, this was the whole time of the war in El Salvador, Oscar Romero, and it was very clear where the fight was at, that there was a different worldview between those who were on the side of the poor and those who were supporting very often the fascist policies of our own government, as we still do in Guatemala and other places. And they said in this document that we should go ahead and encourage and support the more fundamentalist, evangelical, charismatic kind of churches, because very likely they will support the foreign policy of the United States government, being more apolitical. You know, apolitical, saying I don't have any politics, is actually a politics. It is defending the status quo, and that's the naivete of a lot of our evangelical churches, although they've changed in recent years, especially in regard to abortion. But they, for years, pretended to be apolitical. A lot of people will use that position just to stay out of the fray. But in fact, that means you will support the system as it is. That you will maintain and encourage the system as it is, which is a political position. And a kind of dangerous conservatism, because it's unaware. The vast amount of American middle class is precisely that way, very unaware. And therefore will literally believe almost anything. Whatever is on the front page of the paper, they're ready to believe, because they have no undergirding ability to critique it, or to say, is that true or is that not true? And that's something that's really dangerous about our country today. The amount of political naivete about power, and how power is used, and how power is used to oppress the poor. People who say that liberation theology is something new, certainly they're not familiar with the scriptures. And that's so strange that these very groups who claim to be so scriptural are very often the ones who hold this apolitical position. In our Judeo-Christian tradition, which we go back to approximately 1200 before Christ, the Exodus experience, the Moses experience, we have in Exodus 3, if you will, the contemplative, mystical moment, the burning bush. And right after the burning bush, here we have Moses, a murderer, fleeing from justice, watching sheep out in the desert. So he's not the natural saint figure at all. But he has an experience that we call the burning bush experience that seems to be the beginning of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Somehow the bottom opened up, as we talked about when we were talking about contemplation, and he saw the absolute, the holy, the real, the good, the true, the beautiful God. Within 2 sentences of the burning bush, check it out, open Exodus 3 if you don't believe me. After the burning bush experience, within 2 sentences, Yahweh, the voice from the bush, is saying, I hear the groaning of my people in Egypt. Moses, you are to go and confront the Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go. Right? The very beginning of the whole biblical tradition is action and contemplation, if you want to contemplate the contemplative experience that opens up to immediately a mandate to do something in the world. It's not an a-worldly spirituality, Jewish spirituality. Salvation isn't something that is sought later or hereafter. It's very much God is liberating us now, individually and collectively. Now, I can't deny that soon after Exodus, you have the books of Leviticus and Numbers. Not to offend anybody, there's got to be 2 of the more boring books. Those aren't your favorite books. But immediately, when they want to be sent on Exodus, there's these whole people who want to set up house, right? And that's always the tension between the church of Leviticus and Numbers and the church of Exodus to this day. I see the Bible as revealing the process itself, right? I always say, I wish the Bible, just like Stephen Covey's book, gave us 7 habits for highly effective people. Wouldn't that be so much easier? But all of this garbage and wars and people getting the point and fighting the point and missing the point, Girard calls it a text in travail. That it reveals the tension itself of history moving forward, a few people getting the point, most of them, it goes right over their head when God enters history, and some of them actively fight it. And that's the whole movement of the Bible. It reveals the process of history itself, which is why it's such a problematic book. Because people will jump in, and find some quote in Leviticus and then absolutize that. Well, it's only the whole process that has the authority of how God gradually leads us to liberation and how gradually we overcome the would-be violence in God. And you'll see even that just moving step by step by step. Because we're basically comfortable with a violent God. And we'll see this breaking in ever and again. God wanting the heads of people, or God hating people, or God having bears come out of the woods and chewing up 62 little boys. I mean, come on. Do you really believe that? But that's the trouble you get into if you get into what we call proof text reading of Scripture, just finding one line around which you base your theology. You can prove anything you want from the Bible, from one line. You've got to look at the whole pattern. So what we see in the whole pattern here is this gradual movement toward a liberation that the people are almost afraid of or don't want. Even when Moses wants to lead them into the promised land, they are complaining and saying, I think we'd rather go back to Egypt. At least we knew what we had there. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. But this, by the 8th to the 5th centuries before Christ, we have the emergence in a major way. We have prophets before that too, of the writing prophets, and they're always trying to put this together again. The inner experience and the outer experience. Action and contemplation, if you will. The inner journey and the outer journey. And we know that every one of the prophets is killed, up to John the Baptist. And then Jesus says, you killed him, and now you're going to kill me. Which we do, of course. Anybody who tries to put it together is always a threat. We want mystified, rarefied theology that demands nothing of us except seeking some kind of pious, devotional relationship with God. But it doesn't demand anything of history. It doesn't touch our economics. It doesn't touch our lifestyle. It doesn't touch our politics. And I'm afraid this has been more or less the norm even after Jesus. Now we know in that first couple 100-year period, the gospel had a great appeal to the poor, to in great part the lower classes. Not entirely, though. We see people of means already involved in the New Testament. But the big turning point, if we want to have a turning point, is in 313. And in 313, the emperor, Constantine, thinks he's doing us a big favor. And overnight, he makes Christianity the established religion of the Roman Empire. No one is more aware of this than Roman Catholics, because we sort of took it over. All the trappings of Roman Catholicism still share. We moved from the catacombs, with Constantine to the basilicas. And basilica, as you know, means palace. Right? And they became our great churches. And most people don't even know that history and how quickly we change. So there's the date where, if there is one time where the thinking changes, that's it. For example, before 313, it's unthinkable for the most part, almost entirely, that a Christian, for example, would serve in the military. Unthinkable. I mean, on a very practical level. Why? Because the military are killing the Christians. Why would you join a group that's killing you, But you can follow the documents. After 313, within 100 years, the military has become entirely Christian, and guess what? They're killing the pagans. All right? And so we move. Now, this is the gist of it all. We move overnight from the minority position to the majority position. Right? We move overnight from the underground, where I think the Spirit works best, to being in charge of the empire. And the view from the bottom and the view from the top are two different views. If you hold on to nothing else, that's the key insight, I think, of the Jewish bias toward the bottom, the bias toward the alien, the barren woman, the son left out in the field, the enslaved people in Egypt. That's what's absolutely unique about the Jewish scriptures. See, most scriptures always idealize why their country is the best, and why their people are the best, and why we're the center of the world. The Jewish scriptures are in a category all their own, despite what Joseph Campbell says. He says all scriptures are saying the same thing. I think the Jewish scriptures show all the earmarks of real revelation breaking into human history for two reasons. The first one, the one I just mentioned, that they do not idealize the top, they idealize the bottom. Right? And you still see this in many Jewish people to this day. That they will, in our country, for example, even though most Jewish people have made it to the top, they don't vote Republican, right? They vote Democrat, almost entirely. It's very amazing. You see it in a lot of the Irish people. No offense, I know we have an Englishman here, but the Irish will always tell me, we learned what it's like to be oppressed, and we're always told when we got on top, don't be like the English, right? That we're going to remain aware. And really the Kennedys in this country were an example of that. People became very wealthy. But when John Kennedy was killed, the blacks and the poor cried just as much as the rich, which is quite amazing. We got that from the biblical tradition, that bias toward the bottom. The phrase now that Dom Hélder Câmara has used and has now been incorporated in 86% of the constitutions of the religious orders of the church is the preferential option for the poor. You've all heard, preferential option for the poor. It's a rather theological phrase, but it says it's a choice. It's a preferred option. You can read reality from this side, the side of power and money and control and establishment, but when you're on the top of a system, there are certain things you can't see. Right? You have to speak the party line. That's why my Father Francis wouldn't let them ordain him a priest. Because once you're a priest, there's a whole bunch of things you're supposed to say, right? Are supposed to believe, you're supposed to think. I always tell folks that if you want the truth when you go in an institution, don't ask the president or the principal or the rector. Go to the other side. Ask the cook, the janitor, all right, or the receptionist. What's really going on in this institution? Then you'll have a better chance, at least, of finding out what's really happening if you ask the janitor or the cook. Right? But as soon as you formally represent a system, I mean, it has to do with job security. It has to do with self-image. It has to do with maintenance of what you're about. And so you naturally speak well of it. So the preferred option biblically is not the viewpoint from the top, but the viewpoint from the bottom. So that paper I just gave you, I call it the necessary pendulum of history. On the right, we have what we call the establishment. On the left, as soon as you have an establishment, you will have a disestablishment. The right is always concerned with control. The left is invariably preoccupied with freedom. Maybe in a good way, maybe in an unhealthy way. But they're going to be fighting because they're the excluded ones who are not enjoying the fruits of the system. We'll call the right the dominant consciousness, and we'll call the left the alternative consciousness. The right is normally concerned with law and order. Law and order. Everything's law and order. Because, you see, it's their system. Why wouldn't you want to hold together a system that you're the beneficiary of? It's so obvious. Why don't people see that? Why rich in all countries tend to vote very conservative? Because they don't want to change it. Huh? Well, what would be the parties in your country, Tony?
The Conservative Party.
Oh, it's called Conservative. And the more...
Unashamed.
And the Labour Party would be...
That'd be on the left.
Those on the left are always more concerned about change and reform. Now, I don't want you to oversimplify this. Go all the way down with me here. I'm not saying the gospel is on the left. You heard me say that the other day. The gospel is somewhere in between the two of these. Because the right is necessary for authority and continuity in culture. Some sense of respect, the cynicism we're in now, the dismissal of everything, the deconstruction that the West is in now is certainly not the gospel. Right? And that's more the language of the left, the language of dismissal, of undercutting everything and disbelieving everything. The right is normally innocent until proven guilty. If someone is a minority or someone outside the system, for some reason, we just presume they're guilty until proven innocent. In the biblical tradition, we have the kings and the prophets. They only come together once in this whole period, when David the king is willing to hear Nathan the prophet. It's the only time the kings and prophets ever once talk to one another, right? Usually kings just kill prophets. Because prophets are always pointing the finger at the king and saying, you're not doing the truth. You're not supporting the widows and the orphans, is usually the line. You're just, gilding your own lily and feathering your own nest. The right always considers itself the product of rationality, experience, and civilization, even though it has large areas that are irrational, inconsistent, and perhaps even immoral. And really until this century, we spoke of it as the divine right of kings. The authority was basically beyond question. We assumed they held the truth and had some kind of pipeline to God. This still holds on in church circles, of course. The weight of tradition always has the benefit of the doubt. And again, I want to say there's some truth there. I'm not throwing it out. Now on the left, people's movements usually arise out of high-minded ideology, unbearable injustices, or both. We shall overcome being sung in the street. They're not rational, they're not well pre-planned, as much as felt, intuitive, suffering. It comes out of the streets normally. The French people piling up the cobblestones and throwing rocks at the Bastille. They rely on symbols, songs, slogans, and leaders to get off the ground. And when they first start, they normally have no credibility. I'm sure solidarity in your country under Lech Walesa in the early stage probably had no credibility. How can this dare to stand against the communist empire? And of course, the strange thing about communism, and I might say the American Revolution too, is they both started on the left. And then within a generation, they become right to maintain their so-called reform. Isn't that ironic? That's why Thomas Jefferson, most Americans don't know this, Thomas Jefferson said that America should have a reform every 25 years. No, we never told our people about that. Because he knew that's the nature of institutions. The nature of institutions is they're skewed toward self-protection, self-promotion, self-perpetuation. The clergy is this way, the priesthood is this way, the Vatican is this way, the CAC is probably this way, although we try everything we can not to allow it to be that way, but it's the very nature of anything that comes together. It wants to protect itself, right, and maintain itself. So all systems are skewed toward the top and self-perpetuation. And what they do, the more they pyramidize, if that's a word, I don't know, the more you'll find there are people left around the edges who are not enjoying the fruits of the system. And you're not supposed to talk about that. It's like something hidden in plain sight. It's like an open secret in every institution and every country. And as soon as someone takes the side of the excluded ones, the marginalized ones, the poor ones, the ones who are the bad results of the sick system, they're always considered dangerous. You're not supposed to talk about it because you're supposed to keep waving the flag of America, England, or Poland, or Australia. As if flags are somehow from God, you think, Really amazing. I met some Australians when I was over there, and we were talking about the Australian flag and got tears in their eyes. We died for that flag. Well, maybe they did, or some of their friends did. But it's like this is when you get into what the Bible would call idolatry. The worshiping of ideas and groups and institutions instead of God. Now, most of political and church history has been controlled and seen by people from those who've made it. Do you understand? Naturally, those of you who get educated and enjoy the fruits of the system, you write the history books. That's so obvious now. Women are saying this so much. Most of history, for example, has been written by men. History is written by the people who built the pyramids, not the hundreds of thousands of slaves who, in fact, gave their lives for the building of the pyramids. You never hear about that. The Bible in the eyes of Jesus definitely look at life from the other side. And that's the revolutionary, subversive character of the biblical tradition. So the other unique thing about the Jewish scriptures is not just the bias toward the bottom, but this amazing capacity for self-criticism that you still see in healthy Jewish people to this day, and healthy people of any ilk for that matter. But again, most people's sacred stories simply promote their own self-congratulation. And over half of the Hebrew Scriptures, over half of the Old Testament, are passages saying, you are phonies, you are hypocrites, you don't believe a word you say, you do not love God, you hate the poor, all right? And they had the courage, brothers and sisters, the Jewish people had the courage to maintain those scriptures in their sacred texts. And when we read them, from the prophet Isaiah or the prophet Zechariah, we all sit there in church and we say, thanks be to God. We don't believe a word of it, you know? That God has just told us we're full of shit, you know? Thanks be to God. You can tell. And whenever you have healthy religion, you will have this capacity for self-criticism. Whenever religion is unhealthy, I'm not going to make a comment on right now, but I know in my church, criticism is almost impossible right now. Almost impossible. When you're real fragile, when you're real insecure, you cannot say that the king has no clothes on, right? You've got to wave the flag and support the system. And that's just the pendulum of history again. And when you're fragile and shaking at the bottom, you can't bear criticism. The wonderful thing about the 60s and 70s in our church was that it was so capable of self-criticism at the time. In fact, I had managers tell me, they said what happened at the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s in the Roman Catholic Church had no precedent in managerial history. For an institution that was doing as well as we were, seminaries were full, convents were full, the people were pouring in, and the church from the top reformed itself and said, we're wrong on a whole bunch of things. That is really the work of the Spirit. Do you understand? Because that is not the nature of an institution to reform itself from the top when it doesn't need to, right? When it isn't forced to. Normally, until the guns are at our back, we will not change and we will not reform. And that for me will always stand as just a wonderful example of how the Spirit can break into history. Now, the gospel, however, has to be preached to both sides. I'm back on the paper there in Roman numeral 3. The right has to understand the danger of oppression and the nature of what I'm going to call institutionalized violence. Most of us don't have eyes for institutionalized violence. At least maybe those of you from communist countries, but in America we all assumed everything was good until the 60s at least. Here injustices are more the work of social machinery and of unquestioned assumptions and tradition, rather than real bad will. It's just the system is skewed towards self-protection. On the left, these must understand the danger of revolution and the nature of violence in general, that it feeds on itself and becomes a way of life even after victory has been achieved. And this is why we saw this in so many Latin American revolutions. These people who were looking for land reform or for the poor. I was down in Nicaragua and El Salvador in the mid-'80s, and you were always on the side of these people, the Sandinistas or whoever was taking the side of the poor. But the great disillusionment in country after country was that when these people would get in power, they would do the same dang thing all over again. And again, most revolutions start on the left and end on the right. You follow the logic of that? They look for reform, but if there's not, now I'm making the linkage with contemplation, if there's not personal conversion and transformation to God, to powerlessness, the left is just another way to have power. And it says it wants it for the poor, but boy, it's hard to let go of it once you got it, right? To maintain your so-called reform. So time is usually on the side, however, of the left. If it is a real issue, the poor, the truth, the people yelling in the streets will normally win out with some level of truth. But you hope what happens is that there's some leaders like Nelson Mandela who get to the top, who have been refined by fire. But you and I know that's a small minority. A small minority of revolutionaries really are internally transformed people. Most of them are just as power hungry as the right, it seems to me. Evil on the right is usually corporate and systemic. It has the protection of existence and bureaucracy. And heretofore, it's been largely unaddressed by the church because we've been so much a part of the establishment. Do you follow the logic of that? In other words, look at the sins I list there. War. We haven't been critical of war until the beginnings of the 1960s. 1,960 years after Jesus it took us to finally begin to think that Jesus might not be for war. I mean, my God, as Gandhi said, every religion knows that Jesus taught nonviolence except one. Ours. We can't get it. We can't see it. Greed. I mean, I've been a priest for 28 years now. I've never had anybody confess greed to me. It's one of the capital sins. I've never had anybody confess a sin against the 10th commandment. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. Never. It would never enter anybody's mind to confess. You understand? Because it's called capitalism, right? We've made an entire system out of coveting one another's goods. Isn't that amazing? I mean, that's just as much a commandment as the 5th and the 6th and the 7th, but we can't see it. Coveting, mimetic desire, needing, accumulating, hoarding, collecting, more and more and more. We haven't named the sins of the right. It's very interesting. We've put all the sin on the left. I've said for years, and I hope you can get the connection of this, that I think Jesus is simply too much for us, too much for human history. We've grown a year, a century in our capacity to absorb what he's saying. Right? And that makes us about 19 years old. We're going to turn 20 in 2 years. Right? About to grow up and let the gospel really talk to us in an adult way. Profit making. I mean, good Catholics, good Christians who are in the front row of church every week have thought nothing, of making exorbitant profits, of paying their employees nothing, or even treating them unjustly. No one ever confesses that. That's no problem. Just don't have dirty thoughts. I mean, it sometimes feels like such a waste of time to be a confessor. Not with the simple people. When I have them over here, it's wonderful. But if you go to these white, middle, and upper middle class parishes, it's just, you'll have this slum landlord come in. Father, I was impatient with my wife 2 times, and I had 3 impure thoughts. I'm sorry for these and all the sins in my life. Please give me God's forgiveness. Well, I guess. But I think you've largely missed the point of the gospel, and this is some big smokescreen to avoid the real issues. I was impatient with my wife 2 times, and I had 3 dirty thoughts. Go away. You just want to say, this is trivialization of the gospel. Trivialization of what God has come to liberate human history for. And so we get it down to these little privatized sins, usually having to do with the body and sex, if possible, if at all possible. And I've tried to figure that out again and again. And it's not just us, it's most groups. It seems our bodies are where we carry our shame for some reason. It's not just Catholics. I had a Jewish boy come here. He says, I'm just filled with shame about my sexuality. But I think body sins are things you know if you did it or you know if you didn't. Right? We want something measurable. We want something observable. We'd rather know where we stand. But like if I asked you now, I won't ask for a show of hands. If I asked you, how many of you are loving people? I mean, none of you could real quickly, oh yes, I'm a loving person. You'd say, well, I want to be a loving person. And on my better days, I sort of am loving. But you see, you can't measure it, can you? You can't congratulate yourself. How many of you are patient people? Don't let all your hands go up at once. I mean, you can't measure it, you can't control it, you can't say whether you're in or you're out. And so we normally pick up body things. For some reason, they have a measurability factor to them, it seems to me. So, racism, we didn't see racism as a problem until the 60s. I mean, for whatever you say about the 60s, and I know I'm speaking as an American, that it's an amazing decade. You could just say human consciousness just moved, and it could not tolerate things overnight that it was able to tolerate for centuries. And we had black churches and white churches all over the South, in this country, no problem. Sexism, it took till the 80s for us to see that there was an issue there, and most people still don't see that women have been, in most of history, clearly treated as one down in comparison to men, right? And not having the rights, and not having the options, and not having the good power that men could so easily accrue. Because those were corporate sins. Do you understand? Institutionalized evil. Even the Pope speaks of structural sin. And for most people, they don't get it. It goes right over their head. They don't know what you're talking about, right? Because all they know is impatience and dirty thoughts. Those are sin, right? Now, but because we've been trained by the right to think that the sins of the left are the real sins. These individualized things. Notice. Evil on this side is more often what we have called sin. Private, little, nasty, bad, impatient things you do. It's often strategic, individual, momentary. And I'm not saying it's good, evil. If it's evil, it's evil. If it's sin, it's sin. This side, however, has always been reminded of its evils, since the moralists have usually been on the other side. Anger, impatience, intolerance, disobedience, at least intolerance of authority. You were usually told that was a sin. Right? Disobedience, theft, deceitfulness, violence. But note how violence on the right is called just war theory. Whereas violence on the left is called subversion, unjustified revolution, rebellion, and guerrilla warfare. Brothers and sisters, we can't keep having it both ways, right? If we're going to legitimate the violence of governments, if we're going to have parades in Washington and New York where Christians are standing along cheering because we've killed 400,000 Iraqis in the Persian Gulf War, then we've got to recognize and should not be surprised that the boys in the streets of America idealize violence, right? And this has been our blindness. We think we can idealize violence on the right from governments to create a violent society. The government can use violence, the death penalty being one example of that. And then expect people not to believe in the myth of redemptive violence. This whole country is built on the myth of redemptive violence. That somehow violence resolves issues. And once you accept that as your underlying philosophy, which it has been in the 200-year history of America, since we first took up guns against our English brothers, we've never lost that frontier idealization of guns and violence. And it's going to be the undoing of this country, as you all know. But we won't let go of the basic mythology. Do you know, just to get one little dig in, if we would just build one less stealth bomber next year, just one, right, we could give jobs next year, or this summer, right, to every teenager in America. Right? Good jobs to every teenager. If we just would not build one stealth bomber. But that's never questioned. Have you seen that wonderful poster? Do we still have it here, Wendy? When will we start having...
It'll be a good day when the military has to hold a bake sale.
Yeah.
And
the government supports education and the poor, you know. Do you think we'll ever see the day when the military has to have a bake sale? No, because that isn't called into question. I mean, that's the whole thing that is here for good. Now, what I want to give you in this slide, let's see. Remember this history, because we might come back to it a bit. And by the way, in this whole history, there have always been, the people who got it. There have always been the people who moved to the side of the little ones. We call them the saints, and we normally canonize them afterwards. I mean, it's hard in the church to find a single saint who didn't sooner or later disenfranchise herself or himself to take care of the widows or the orphans or the boys who weren't being taught or the girls who were prostitutes. I mean, that's the founder and the founders of every religious order. I mean, Mother Teresa is not a new Catholic phenomenon. It's like there's always some who get it, who make the preferred option to go to the other side, because only from the bottom do you see clearly, where you have nothing to prove and nothing to pretend. There you can read reality correctly. Now, Dom Hélder Câmara is the Holy Archbishop of Brazil, still alive. He's the one who coined the phrase, the preferential option for the poor. We have a picture of him in the kitchen in there. He wrote a little piece for my 50th anniversary, or 50th birthday book. And we've met several times. A truly holy man. He spoke right here at the hall next door one time. He was also the bishop at the Second Vatican Council who begged the bishops to all take off their sapphire diamond rings. He said, how can followers of Christ be wearing these things? And they still don't wear them. But he's the one who dared to stand up and suggest it to the whole group, that bishops should not be wearing expensive jewelry. But anyway, he's taught for years, and I won't say it nearly as well as he does. He says there's 3 levels to the spiral of violence. The first level is the one I've partially described already: institutionalized violence or structural sin. Institutionalized violence. That's as long as a German word. Institutionalized violence, structural sin. Normally, it's hidden, you can't see it. It's in the very nature of how things are. It's the way the system works, skewed in favor of power and control and the status quo. He says if this first level of violence is not exposed and seen for what it is, and it usually isn't, because the whole system is skewed to keeping it hidden, how much it protects itself, the spiral will continue to unfold to the next level, which he calls reactive violence, or the violence of despair. Or he calls it this institutionalized evil and reactive evil. He's not denying this is evil too. In other words, these are the people who have been kept out of the system, who have not enjoyed the fruits and the benefits of the system, and they start, God forbid, throwing rocks at the Queen's window. How dare you throw rocks at the Queen's window? Well, this is certainly material for being imprisoned, jailed, fined, or whatever. You're a threat to the system. Now, no one ever recognizes, well, some people do, but why is this guy throwing rocks, Well, he's broken the laws of the kingdom, he's broken the laws of the land, therefore he must be punished. And so then we have something in place that is the third level, which is in place to keep this whole thing in control, right? It would be the penal system, right? The legal system, the war system, and largely more and more the whole economic system itself. This doesn't look bad, does it? I mean, in England, I keep picking on you, but they wear wigs, and they're up on big platforms to make it all look above suspicion, And what we just said about the whole war system, this whole thing is usually beyond criticism. And it makes itself above criticism. Because it has to be to keep this whole thing down here under wraps. In Catholic theology, we said there were 3 sources of evil in this order: the world, the flesh, and the devil. If you do not point out the first level of violence, the second 2 are inevitable. All right? And this one will take on diabolical proportions and uncriticizable proportions. Where you have to do the criticism is down here. Now this, for me, is the job of a prophet. To just keep pointing here, right? Like Dorothy Day in New York said, when will we stop believing that the dirty, rotten system is a dirty, rotten system, all right? Instead of all on bended knee before the system. This is America. This is my country. This is good, and it's seeking liberty and justice for all, isn't it? Liberty and justice for some. Now, conservatives tend to put all their energy into this level of keeping people from throwing rocks at the Queen's window, from doing these bad things, theft, lying, and I'm not saying those things are good things to do. But evil is normally very privatized, very individual. It's the sins of what the biblical tradition would call the flesh. It doesn't mean sex, it means private, personal weakness, brokenness, powerlessness, sinfulness. Puts all your sins are these little bad things that you have done. Liberals, I tend to put all their energy in trying little by little, to chip away at this. Right? But it's already in place. This is the sort of moral inadequacy of the Democrats in our country, so many leftists, that they put all their criticism up here, which is often deserved, but they normally never call this into question. Their own lifestyle. You understand? That they're benefiting from the system, that they're a part of the system. That's why, like Tepeyac and the Senator's emphasis on simple living, and my own father Francis's emphasis upon simple living is so appropriate. Because really the only way out of the whole game is to buy out of it down here. You follow the logic of this? Once you accept the system uncritically and the benefits that you accrue from it, and I do too, believe me, I'm enjoying the fruits of the American system. But don't enjoy them too much. You don't become too addicted to them, because then you'll protect this and you'll protect this. So the prophet, I guess the radical, and radix is not a bad word, in Latin means root. The radical is simply the one who does not try to deal with the symptoms, but tries to look at the root issue. That's why we speak of radical grace here. The radical doesn't point here or here, but right down here. It says it's the very system itself, which is not built according to the Sermon on the Mount, according to right relationship, according to taking care of the excluded and the poor or the little ones. That the system itself is taking care of itself. And again, I want to repeat, if you missed it the first time, Dom Hélder says, if you do not recognize the violence at this first level, the second and the third are inevitable. And this one will take on godly proportions. That's why probably the tradition calls it down. You can't even criticize up to now the penal system, the legal system, the war system, and in most countries the economic system. It's all controlled. Because that's the thing that's needed to keep this group down, following, right? Who are the rebels who are screaming in the streets, and to keep this hidden, to keep this denied, so we don't look at it too much. Great book to read is Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. Have you ever seen it? And you open it up and you say, how come nobody told me this in 5th grade American school? To read every single one of our wars from the other side, like the Great Alamo. Read it from the Mexican side instead of the American side. And you realize everything we've been taught. Not that it was 100% wrong, right? But not that it was 100% right either. It was always from our biases, from our pretensions, from our illusions. And I have no doubt that's the same in the history of Poland and of England and of Australia, right? It's simply the nature of all countries. That we can see what we want to see, what we need to see to hold ourselves together. Now, I'm going to give you one more paper, and I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but this is another way of describing this preferential option for the poor, what I call the privileged position of the poor. That in those first centuries, the church was in great part the church of the poor. In the subsequent centuries after 313, through especially the saints and religious orders, we became the church for the poor. And I think the best we can probably do now is be at least the church with the poor. And I hope it's not just a change of preposition. In other words, the fact that you and I are even in this room today, and well-dressed and educated, you and I are not poor people. We can't. If you can travel here, you're not a poor person. I'm not a poor person, even though I'm supposed to be a Franciscan. I'm quite comfortable and ashamed of it. But I am. We all probably are a little bit ashamed of how comfortable we are. Once you're educated, you see, you can sort of get out of any dilemma. You have a certain kind of self-confidence, a certain kind of verbal ability. I could take all money out of your pocket and your credit cards and your phone card and set you down in St. Louis all alone. And you would still, maybe you'd go through a few hours of anxiety, but you'd know how to get out of it. You understand? You would know. Finally, someone to make contact with, because you have contact, you have access, you have intelligence, you have verbal ability. You could explain yourself to somebody who would trust you and help you climb your way back. What it means to be poor is not to have that access. It's not primarily a financial description. So I go to the next paragraph. The poor person is one who temporarily or permanently finds himself or herself in a situation of weakness, dependency, or humiliation. This is most of the human race, by the way. Most people who've ever lived. It's a state characterized by a lack of means. I do not have the means to accomplish what I would like to. So it's a deep experience of powerlessness. It can be in the form of money. It can be in the ability to form relationships, influence, power, science, technology, honorable birth, physical strength, intellectual ability, personal freedom, or human dignity. There's a lot of ways where people can feel poor. A lot of people have 5 or 6 of those. Now, the poor person might well be at fault to some degree. But poverty is primarily a psychological state which one surrenders to after repeatedly being assaulted by negative voices. When you're told again and again, you're ugly, you're stupid, you're no good, you can't do it, you can't do it. Now, a lot of people, that starts with their father and their mother, putting them down all the time and telling them they can't do it, so they think they can. Soon they are oppressed, and they can't even recognize, much less take advantage of the opportunities that might present themselves. I have Mass here at the jail for the last 10 years on Sundays, and it's the case with most of the guys and the gals there. They just, you feel like they're shooting themselves in the foot. You feel like they're their own worst enemies. You and I were trained to be winners, right? To know how to take advantage of opportunities that were given us. There's more and more people who don't know how to do that because they're just sure, even when they do it, they're not going to make it, right? Because of the color of their skin very often, because of their lack of inner confidence even more often. That people have told them they're ugly and stupid and no good, and they believe it. So why try? They have nothing to lose by violence. Really. They understand. They feel they're being chewed up down here anyway. We don't realize that more and more of our world has nothing to lose by violence, right? The whole system, they feel, maybe you'd say wrongly, the feel has screwed them anyway, so why not remain out here and just keep throwing rocks at the Queen's window? They're going to hate me anyway. Soon they can't even recognize, as I say, and the poor person has no possibility of changing his state without at least some help or good news from another. You can't preach the gospel to yourself, but you know that? You got to hear it. You got to have someone else love you. You got to have someone else look in your eyes and say, you're a beloved son. You're a good man. You're a good woman. Then you can believe it. It's amazing how mimetic we are, how socially contagious we are, how caught up in one another's world we are. When people, I think this is what Jesus meant, whose sins you shall forgive, they are forgiven, and whose sins you shall retain, they are retained. When you hate people, they believe it, right, about themselves and become a mirror image of your hatred. When you have mercy on people and embrace people and love people, they sometimes slowly, but eventually believe it. If you got it early from a good mom and dad like I had, and I hope a lot of you have, then you believe it early. It's a great, great head start. But normally oppressed peoples form a whole subculture, which takes differing forms in differing ages and times. These subcultures are controlled normally by fear, anger, guilt, prejudice, superstition. I see it all down at the jail, or here in the South Valley of Albuquerque. Compulsive behavior, inhibitions, fantasies, fatalism, conformity, hopelessness, sexual acting out, passivity. It's all true, and probably parts of it are true in our lives too. The outsider normally can't understand these people who are shooting themselves in the foot. You just want to shake them. It's like your teenage boy or teenage girl. Why are you doing this? Don't you realize you're your own worst enemy? That their self-image becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The outsider, we who are elites, white, wealthy, secure, above, we usually call them lazy, right? You understand? That's the easy way. That's the easy way. Because we don't realize that. I mean, I was a white boy in Kansas. The whole system was made for me. I didn't realize that it only took this much effort for me to succeed in the system, right? Whereas maybe a black boy in my same town, it would have taken this much effort for him to succeed at the same project. But unless you've befriended a black man someday, or a woman on welfare, or a prostitute, or a homosexual, you don't know that the system is skewed against the outsider. We misinterpret almost everything from our position of presumed knowledge and superiority. The oppressed normally in every culture does this, really, and even very poor cultures will have degrees of those who are hateful and unacceptable. The oppressed become the screen, to use Jungian language, for our own shadow projections. They normally become despised and separated. Our words now are alienated, marginalized, pushed to the periphery. The poor, therefore, mentally and physically handicapped, I just want to give you more names than simply economically poor people. Minority groups in general, in any culture. Refugees who don't belong in our country, as if God created these boundaries between countries. The addicted, the homosexual, the prisoner. Anybody who's failed in our social or economic success system. Normally, in my opinion, they represent, brothers and sisters, what we are most afraid of within ourselves and what we most deny within ourselves. You know what the shadow side of America is? Failure. That's our shadow. That's what we're afraid of. Failure. So anybody who we can deem a failure, who doesn't succeed in our system, these are the sinners. These are the unworthy ones. These are the ones who don't have the right to the fruits of the system, because we've so idealized power and success. We've so idealized money and being at the top. And so anyone who isn't cool and well-dressed and up there has to be a loser. Right? And then I think of my father, St. Francis, who tries to be the poorest man in the season. Francis emerged right when history was beginning to idealize trade and the mercantile middle class, people who were going to rise by a whole new kind of power. And his father was one of those people, if you know the life of St. Francis. And so he reacted radically against it. A recent life of St. Francis was done by a Jesuit who had access to the city records in Assisi. And he actually was able to find out that Pietro Bernardone, Francis's father, the economy was very poor at that time, and Francis's father, they have the deeds of sale, was buying up these poor little farms that were going underneath all around Assisi. And he was into agribusiness, I guess, and then making it into his cloth shop in town. And now we understand even formally, historically, why Francis, who had a terrible relationship with his father, reacted so much against early capitalism and early achieving by money. I believe, to get back to the paper here, that Jesus is primarily addressing the good news to this excluded group, to this little group. Not because they're naturally holier. Don't hear me, don't quote me as saying that. You know, that people who are poor naturally love God. People who are poor are naturally all, on the right path. You can be poor and totally greedy and totally violent. And we all know people like that. And you can be rather wealthy and comfortable, and be totally disconnected to it. We wouldn't have that house Tepeyac, except a wonderful couple friend of mine. Just when I told them I needed it, they wrote a check for $100,000. Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, go. I mean, their money means nothing to them. You understand? They just want to do something good for the world. They take refugees into their house and everything, but they're wealthy in many ways. By the time Jesus has come, the temple itself, the architecture of the temple, reveals what every institution does, what every group in history does. It creates degrees of in and out. It creates degrees of worthy and unworthy. We have the Holy of Holies, which only the high priest can go into. We have the court of the circumcised Jewish men, which only the circumcised Jewish men can go into. No, excuse me, the court of the priests and Levites, I said. Priests and Levites, yeah. High priest here. Then the court of the circumcised men, and then the outer court of the Jewish women. But they hardly ever got in, except some months, but I think maybe a week out of the month. Because after every menstruation, they were impure. After every childbirth, they were impure until they offered some appropriate pigeons or something to God. Now, I always stop at this point, and I always say, women, of course, understand. Because whenever you're in the one-down position, you understand. Right? Do you really think that was from God? It has all the
or
the laws. It has all the earmarks of what we now call patriarchy. All right? And creating a religion that always places us inside, whoever the in-group is, and the other group outside. Then if you go, let's say, to Leviticus, the law of holiness, from chapter 16 to 23, you have 7 distinct groups out here. Okay? First of all, the women who were out there much of the time, although they would get in after they got pure. Right? The lepers, who really was a generic term for all kinds of eczema, psoriasis, skin diseases, contagion, and it probably came out of normal medical concerns for quarantine and so forth. But all those people called lepers might be many kinds of disease. And I'm sure your preachers have told you that to make any kind of physical contact with those people was yourself to be impure for at least another 3 weeks or a month and incapable of going to the temple. And that's why almost every healing of a leper in the New Testament goes out of its way to say Jesus touched it. Right? Marvelous. I mean, we don't get the radicalism of that. Because once Jesus touches them, he's outside the system too. And he can't go to the temple. He is impure. And if you think that's changed, I think of the priests and nuns and lay people in the recent years who've told me that merely by ministering to AIDS patients, they are called bad names, right? And accused of being homosexual or See, this doesn't change. It simply gets more sophisticated. When you touch the offending group, you are one of them. And you're like them. There were the Gentiles. Now that's probably, are there any Jews in this group? Are there any partial Jews? All right, let's assume that all of us are out here. You and I don't have a clue. You and I don't have a chance. We may not even enter the temple. We're Goyim, our Gentiles. We're lost. Now I'm not making fun of the Jews, because every religion does this. Before Vatican II, we thought this about Protestants. The poor things, those poor Protestants. They're all heretics. And every group does it. I don't know how you'll do it, but you'll find some way to define another group as lost, unworthy, and unacceptable.
Of course, the Protestants always thought the same thing.
Oh yes, it was both ways. That's right. Yeah, in fact, I think many Protestant groups preached against us. I don't think we ever preached against the Protestants. We just felt sorry for them. Because they were all lost. Then we have to say, there's a whole bunch of descriptions of it, but it's really the handicap, right? To have a whole bunch of physical ailments was to be morally tainted and unacceptable, and it was assumed to be a curse from God. We call that now blaming the victim. Double victimization. Not only did their body have some handicap, but then they're told by the system, you're unworthy to enter the temple. The Bastard Sons of Priests was another group. I'm sure those still exist. I'm forgetting a couple others maybe. Lepers, handicapped women, Gentiles. Oh, sinners. Now, sinners, it's not the same way we use the word, all right? Sinner is a very objective category. This is part of the radical nature of the Christmas story, which no one thinks is radical. Inviting New Agers and shepherds to be the only two that isn't, you know. These are two people in this class, you know. They're two outsiders. Shepherds were so outside the system, they didn't come to the temple, they lived on the edge of town, did not have the money to jump all the hoops and offer the cereal offerings and debt codes and purity codes. It was simply assumed that they were objectively sinners. So sinner is not a subjective category, like we would think of it. It's an objective category. Right? Tax collectors. That's why just using the word tax collector, he is a sinner. Right? And because he's got a job. I mean, maybe they were sort of right. Maybe we should have had that for people who build weapons and so forth. Certain jobs made you incapable of being one of God's people. Now, some of them were by reason of poverty, however, like shepherds. But anyway, if you want to do some very exciting scripture study, don't take my word for this. You just go to Mark's Gospel, Luke's Gospel, Matthew's Gospel, and you see who are the people who fight Jesus up to his crucifixion. They're all in these groups. And you want to see who the people who Jesus can heal and touch and transform, who love him, they're always in these groups. Always. Always. I don't think there's hardly any exception. That's what I mean by the bias toward the bottom. That you have a symbolic advantage. Remember the diagram I gave you in contemplative prayer, how I told you, when you're cut off, when you're separated, let's call them the prostitute and the drunkard and the tax collector in the New Testament. When you're marginalized, oppressed, victimized, called stupid and silly and ugly, you actually have a symbolic head start because you feel your cut-offness, your fragility. That's what we're talking about here. These folks can think they have it. God can be most lost by being thought found. And when the system, and every religion does it, thinks it's found God by its right dogmas and doctrines and liturgies and bishops and popes and all these accidentals, it can be an avoidance of the whole journey of transformation. So that, to get back to the paper, I believe that's why Jesus is primarily addressing the good news to this group. Why at Luke 4:18, his first announcement of himself in Luke, he says, I've come to preach the gospel to the poor. And his opening line of the Sermon on the Mount, happy are you poor, the kingdom of God is yours. Now it's softened a little in Matthew, happy are the poor in spirit. But it's still, in all accounts, the first opening line of Jesus. I mean, this can't be a minor point. Do you follow me? This cannot be a peripheral issue. He starts with this, that the little ones have a head start in understanding what he's talking about. To be the church, I believe we who probably are not necessarily the poor, we have to be in immediate contact with them somewhere in our life. Or, at least for starters, getting in touch with that leper inside of you. That part of you that you're ashamed of, that you deny, that you hate, that you avoid, that you run from. That's where the inner journey and the outer journey come together. Often it's by embracing your inner leper. I'm not going to say often, I'm going to say most of the time. It's by embracing your inner leper that you find the compassion to understand the other lepers, so-called, of society. That's the coming together of contemplation and action, the inner journey and the outer journey. And that's why the gospel position is different from mere leftist ideology. Can you feel the difference now? I'm not here preaching leftist ideology. I hope I'm talking the gospel. The gospel is that hanging in between we talked about the other day. where you know your complicity in the evil of this world, you're enjoying the fruits of the system, you don't waste any time projecting it or scapegoating it over there. And that's the final point that I want really to communicate to you. I mentioned to you that, I think I mentioned to you, how much influence the thinking of René Girard can have on me. It continues to have on me, and now his interpreters are just pouring on the woodwork all over. When I was in Innsbruck last January, he was sort of the name that everybody was talking about. René Girard is perhaps the foremost anthropologist in anthropology circles today. He was the head of the department at Stanford in California until somewhat recently. He was born a French Catholic, like much of his generation, left the church, did not take it seriously. And then, as anthropologists do, tried to say, what is the dynamism that is moving human history forward? And he came up with two principles. I won't be able to give you much of the second, the mimetic theory, although I've already been referring to it, that where human beings are essentially imitative and contagious, and we do what we see, and we want what we see. It's called covetousness, concupiscence, desire. He says anthropologically, it's obvious to him the world is going to be destroyed by two things, greed and violence. Once you hear it, it's hidden in plain sight, of course. Greed and violence will destroy the world. He said, therefore, if someone's going to be a great spiritual teacher, I'm going to assume as an anthropologist, now he wasn't interested in promoting religion, that a great teacher is going to have clear taboos against greed and clear taboos against violence. When I discovered this, René Girard, I was writing that book, Jesus' Plan for a New World, which was my attempt to understand the Sermon on the Mount. And honestly, the whole Sermon on the Mount is against greed and against violence. But not only does he say, and it's the least quoted of all of Jesus' teaching, because we just can't hear it. We're only 19. Remember, we're only 19. That helps us a little bit. Not only are we going to be destroyed by greed and violence, but he says there's a direct line from one to the other. And that's why all the great world religions have such major taboos against what they call covetousness, concupiscence, hoarding, money, collecting, or what Buddhism made a whole religion out of the warnings against desire. You've got to squelch this endless desire because it will never be satisfied. It always wants more, which is the very nature of greed, that is an addiction. I mean, are our American billionaires satisfied with how many do they? No. You always want more. And so you've got to disbelieve the lie at the very beginning, because he says once you accept the lie of that the self is out there. Now, this is getting back to what I taught you about contemplation, right? That there's something over there that can make me happy. That there's something I can take in. As long as you believe that, then he says this is an inevitable lie. Now, I'm not going to have the time to give you what it takes in books to communicate. He says once you start the game of comparing, you move to competition. Once you move to competition, you move to resentment. He says America and Western Europe are in one great big culture of resentment today. The resentment moves to open rivalry. The rivalry moves to scapegoating. And the scapegoating moves to sacred violence, sacred offenses. And as Jesus says in John's Gospel, when you kill me, you will think you're doing a holy action for God. Most killing in human history, most violence is done without any guilt. You understand? Because people think they're preserving democracy or liberty or our sacred institutions. Do you understand? It just moves, he moves all the way along to show our comparison, which we made an art form of. We call it advertisement in billboards and movies, and so where you're looking around trying to find your identity in something other than yourself. Comparison leads to competition, leads to resentment, leads to rivalry, leads to scapegoating, leads to sacred violence. I want to spend the last few minutes especially explaining this one, because that's his second point. He says, and I find it very compelling truth, that the central mechanism of human history is the scapegoating mechanism. Central. That it's in the hard wiring of individuals and of institutions to hate, to attack, to accuse the other. And he says, what has held every culture together, and he goes to great lengths to say, you show me an exception. Every culture, an institution has to have someone else to be against. And as long as you have an enemy and someone else to be against, it holds you together very well. Catholicism held together very well up to Vatican II, as long as we could dismiss Protestants. Right? Once we said Protestants know Jesus a lot of times better than we do, we lost half of our energy for being Catholic. Do you follow me? Oh, why be Catholic then if these Methodists know Jesus just as much as we do?
And now we turn on ourselves.
Well, that's what happens. That's what happens. That's why civil wars are the worst. And, America held together very well from 1945 to 1965. It'll be obvious to you. Why? Because evil was in Germany, evil was in Japan, and evil was behind the Iron Curtain. We were actually disappointed to see the Berlin Wall fall. I mean, no one wants to say that. But we were. America doesn't know what to do with itself since the Berlin Wall fell. And do you know militias and violence in the streets of America have increased 500% since the Berlin Wall fell? Now it's all here. The enemy, we didn't know what militias were in 1989. Most Americans didn't know the word. Now all 50 states have them. And most of them are against our own government. That anxiety, Girard says, that fear inside of all of us, it's buzzing around like a hornet in a hornet's nest. And it's got to find some place to go. It needs some place to go. The way you turn hatred or anxiety, and it works so well, that's why we keep doing it. The way you turn it into harmony, almost overnight, like after a lynching or after a good war, the movement from here to here is via the scapegoat. You've got to have someone whom you can project all the evil onto. And then, when you kill them, fight them, exclude them, expel them, punish them, you sort of feel good about yourself. He goes through all of history. After most guillotine killings and hangings and drawn and quarters and Tyburn, the crowd would cheer.
Entertainment.
Entertainment. We're together again. We're together again. We've gotten rid of the heretics. We've gotten rid of the sinners. We've gotten rid of the blacks. Gotten rid of the whoever the race is. But it's accidental. You've just got to have somebody. In our country, it tends to be the poor. Although he says it's getting ever more sophisticated, the search for scapegoats. In most of previous history, if you killed your enemies, there was a bronze statue of you forever in Vienna or London. Right? There you stand with a sword or a cannon or a gun. And when you go through Europe, you say, did they not know what to do with bronze? Build statues of people with guns who killed people. I mean, it's the only thing I see in Europe in the city squares is people on horses, always very macho and manly. And he won this war. He killed this. It's so sick once you see it for what it is. But you see, that held the country together for 50 years. That's good. Now it's falling apart. Now Girard, this led him back to the gospel, led him back to Jesus. He says it's falling apart because of the preaching of the gospel. Now, you don't have to believe that if you want to. But he calls it the virus of the gospel has been released in the world. And we're the only people, Christians, who worship the scapegoat. We worship the victim. I mean, the crucified Jesus is not a natural symbol for God. It's a strange symbol for God. I said the other day, why would God take on this shape, this meaning? Becoming the excluded one, the expelled one, the problem one. It is better that one man die than that the whole people perish. He says, because scapegoating is the central mechanism of human history, God, to save human history, had to name the lie. This is what Romans says. He became the lie so he'd stop lying. The crucified Jesus is telling history, you kill what you should love. The thing which could save you is the thing you go out after.
and you attack. So we call Jesus, we Christians, the most perfect man who ever lived. And that's the one, church and state. Think of that. Rome and Jerusalem. That's why the passion accounts go to such length. Say, Caiaphas and Pilate, those boring long accounts. Both systems said, he's the problem. Get rid of him, and we'll hold together. We kill what we should love. But it's getting harder to do it. Poor George Bush, after his Persian Gulf debacle, his fame only lasted 90 days. That's unknown in history. He wasn't even reelected. You were assured of being king or prince or emperor forever, normally if you killed your enemies. But the gospel, he says, is destabilizing human history. It's like taking away from us what we've needed to live on, hatred. And can you feel this sometimes? It's like, I don't know what to do with my hatred. I know I'm a Christian. I know I'm not supposed to hate, but boy, I'd like to hate her. Boy, I'd like to attack her. Boy, I'd like to get rid of him. Boy, that's the way the human mind works. Because it gives us a sense of moral purity, a sense of innocence, and it works almost immediately. Once you can find an enemy, once you can find someone to hate. Jesus is the only revolutionary who validates no victims. He does the victim thing right. Neither does he play the victim himself and ask for us to feel sorry for him, and neither does he ask anybody to pay for his death. Now that's unknown. There's no account in the New Testament or early Christian writings for any claiming for vengeance against the death of Jesus. Right? Which shows a new consciousness has been inserted into the world. An utterly new consciousness, which we would call the risen Jesus, which is all about forgiveness and non-punishment and non-violence. We finally, in the risen Jesus, overcome all violence in God. Check it out in all four gospel accounts. You have he doesn't even bring it up, that everybody abandoned him and rejected him. In fact, Peter, the so-called first pope, he just gives him 3 chances to say, I love you. Rather than bring it up that he denied it 3 times. Now, that's God taking away human shame. But an utterly non-violent God, an utterly non-punishing God, suddenly, if you get the accounts of the risen Jesus, it's a very liberated and safe universe. It's not religion based on fear anymore. It's not religion based on exclusion. And what Girard goes to great lengths to show is no one has been better at the scapegoating mechanism than religion itself. So probably you could say religion has been the most violent thing in human history. Because if you want to find a way to be hateful, right, to be cruel, to be narcissistic, but to not have to feel the guilt about it, you know the way to do it? Do it for God. It works. Be hateful for Jesus. Kill commies for Christ. Right? Whole generations of Americans did that. Just kill those damn communists. We're doing it for Jesus, And Jesus will love us for this. That's the lie. Looking for what you can expel. So Jesus becomes the expelled one. As Hebrews says, crucified outside the walls. Right? And therefore let us follow him outside the walls. That's the preferential option for the poor. Let us follow him outside the walls. We're going to come over here and look at life from this side, from the side of the expelled ones, and ourselves stop expelling and excluding and looking for victims. You can almost use it as a litmus test for even individually where you're at today. If your mind, and this is what you're going to see in the first 10 minutes of your study, that the mind is still judgmental, violent, accusing, expelling. On those days when I don't need, even in my mind, to hate anybody, to judge anybody. That's about as close as I know what it might mean to be saved, to be enlightened, to be in Jesus, to be in Christ, to be transformed, to be a new creation when I don't need to hate. And I believe that the gospel has given the world that kind of liberation. Girard says without it, and maybe this will seem overly dramatic to some of you, history is on an inevitable path toward mutual self-destruction. Unless some people get it. Unless some people get it. Now, my personal opinion, I hope this doesn't make me a heretic, but I don't think Jesus ever intended, there's not much evidence, that the whole world was going to become Christian. Christendom. You know? Look at the damage it did in Europe. These nations thinking they were Christian and thinking they personified Christendom. Jesus' clear images are leaven hidden inside the dough, mustard seed, salt. You can't even see it, but you know when it's there, when it's not there. I think to be a Christian is to share the fate of God for the life of the world. I think it's always going to be a minority position. I think it's a vocation. Paul speaks of it as being conformed to the pattern of his death, and therefore raised to the pattern of his resurrection. It's a different kind of human being. It's a different kind of awareness in this world. That is a very transformed awareness. Jesus is building on the Jewish tradition of the remnant, the 10 just men, the minyan, the quorum that was necessary for a Jewish worship gathering. And I think what we're going to be seeing in the next century, as Christianity more honestly moves to that minority position, and recognize that we can't force the gospel by dominative consciousness, or we become the establishment and we move back into sacred violence. My judgment is that Jesus thinks the 10 just people, the remnant, if some people allow themselves to be transformed into God, I don't know what else to say, how else to say it, those few will be enough to keep human history from self-destruction. Because otherwise, this is the path it's going. And that doesn't take much proving right now. Right? The whole third world is imitating us in precisely this stuff as it watches our idiotic American television and movies. But if enough don't believe it, if enough are transformed by the scapegoat to not creating victims themselves, but participating in the victimhood of Jesus and of the world, those people, I believe, are the transformed agents and transforming agents for that world. So I hope that is making the essential linkage between action and contemplation. For me, it's a spiritual transformation. This is nothing you can get people to by leftist ideology or by angry placards. And I've held angry placards too, I'm not saying as well. Do you understand that? But ours is a third way. It's different than simply taking on the bastards, killing the guys, getting rid of the opposition. Let's get back to what I said the other day. It's holding the tension and paying the price for it inside ourselves. Let me just take one more minute to give you a further description of that scapegoat ritual in case you're not familiar with it. In Leviticus 16, on the Day of Atonement, this poor old goat was brought into that Holy of Holies, the center part, and the high priest apparently would lay on the goat all the sins of the people, and the people would beat it into the desert. Recently, they discovered a liturgical text that we never had access to before in some Mediterranean library, and the ritual was described in even greater detail. It might be the way it was celebrated, it probably was in Jesus' lifetime. And this is what it said. It says the goat's head is to be wrapped in thorns. The goat is to be clothed in a red or purple cloak. The goat is to be spit upon by the entire community, a natural symbol of putting your garbage over there. And almost a reverse of Palm Sunday, they are to take reeds and palms and to beat the goat into the desert. Massive general confession. I mean, if you really believe that worked, then I'd do it too. I'd beat the goat into the desert. But now, and it really was a genius liturgical ritual. Absolute genius. It worked. It held Israel together. All of our sins are out there. We're good. But now we Christians know that those passion accounts that we've read in the four Gospels and heard read on Good Friday were clearly trying to present to Christians Jesus as the cosmic scapegoat. But we didn't have the anthropology, the history, to know how symbolic his whole death was and what the question is that Jesus was trying to answer for human history. That he became the scapegoat to reveal to us the lie of scapegoat. Got it? He became the victim so you and I would stop creating victims. And then it gave us the foundation for true union in God not on being against anything, which is the normal way people find union, by being against somebody else, but now by being for God, what you're in love with, what you do believe in, not just who else is wrong or who else is the problem. So let me stop. I know I'm beyond time already, but I at least want to give you a couple moments. If there's some questions just dangling there that have to be responded to, I'm happy to try. Anybody at all. I threw a lot at you in an hour and a half.
I was very intrigued by the Girard philosophy, you know. Can you give me a little more information on where I can find out about it?
Did I bring it back? Let me give you his name correctly. Unless you have some background in anthropology, he's very hard to understand, right? He's very brilliant. I think I have them mostly over in my room, and I'm happy to bring them over for you. They're like $30 a piece, these books. You know, they're very expensive. Now, a man named Gil Bailey, have you heard that?
No.
And at least one or two of these copies are on your reserve shelf. He tried to bring René Girard down a few steps and wrote a book called Violence Unveiled. Violence Unveiled by Gil Bailey. Now, Gil and I did a set of tapes together a year or so ago, but he still goes over so many people's heads. So I've been trying to bring him down. This is the Franciscan role, to bring it down to the ordinary people, you know. But still, this would be really the book I'd recommend, Violence Unveiled by Gil Bailey. Robert Hamilton Kelly is taking it and applying it to Paul and Mark's Gospel. It's for many scripture people the greatest breakthrough in this century in understanding what the Bible's about. The overcoming of the violence in God.
What was the name of the second author?
Robert Hamilton Kelly, /Kelly. Robert Hamilton Kelly. He's got one on Mark's Gospel and Sacred Violence and Paul and Sacred Violence. He claims that Paul, and there's a lot of evidence, Paul really understood this mechanism and why Jesus was answering it. Because see, Paul, being a good Jewish boy, had become, in the name of God, a mass murderer. And that's his great, being thrown to the ground on the road to Damascus. My God, what have I become? In the name of God, I'm a killer. Right? And he says, on a certain level, all of us have to have our road to Damascus experience, where we realize, I'm not seeking God, I'm using God to seek myself. Right? And he says Paul really understands this mechanism and goes to great lengths to show that I'll never read Paul the same again. But why he said Paul speaks much of being in Christ is the only way out of this inevitable dynamic, both of greed and of violence. Let me end by saying this too. I don't want what I'm saying to be interpreted as a new form of Christian imperialism. Do you understand? Please don't hear me talking that way. Right? Saying, unless you're a certain kind of believer in the name and word of Jesus Christ, you're not saved. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that I believe Jesus' life, passion, death, and resurrection and teaching have answered an absolutely central question for the salvation of human history. Right? That doesn't mean most Christians got it. I would say most Christians missed the point. He thinks never more than 10% of any Christian country or any Christian century got the point. Now it's increasing exponentially, by the way. Both the need for scapegoats is increasing exponentially, and the people who are getting it, who can't hate anymore, who can't kill anymore, both are increasing and realizing no one else is my problem, as I told you the other day. But the irony was, Girard says that we who worship the scapegoat, dared to kiss the cross, use Jesus to scapegoat Muslims, to scapegoat Protestants, Catholics, one another, and the one group that you think we never would have scapegoated, the Jews themselves. And that reached its epitome in this century, in the most educated country in Europe, the Germans. Right? My God, how could we be this wrong? But there were always those few who got it, who could not hate. But the irony of ironies was that we scapegoated ourselves while worshiping the scapegoat, and then even scapegoated his own race, his own people. That Mary and Joseph and the 12 apostles of Jesus were themselves Jews. You'd think there'd be one race that'd be absolutely safe from Christians. We'd never touch a Jew. We wouldn't dare touch a Jew. We'd kiss Jews' feet, you'd think, wouldn't you? And then we killed them. It's a compelling analysis. I've never been the same, and I know many of my colleagues feel the same. This has finally given us a take on what the Bible is really saying in terms of that text in travail, what it's doing for the liberation of human history. And if it offers you that, I'm sure happy to give it to you. Anybody else? Yes.
One of the things I think I've been focusing on is the hatred, anxiety, the emptiness, the whatever that is, the angst, has to, go someplace. So
Has
you're not
to
going
go.
to scapegoat it. And I think that's where it ties back to the contemplation.
That's right.
And that, that basically,
That's right.
you can't just stop it up. You can't just say, oh, I'm not going to do it.
No.
And that's where I think it's the whole self-emptying, it's the whole 12-step thing, it's the whole thing.
Thank you.
The only way, if you just bottle it up and say, I'm not going to do it, you'll implode.
That's right. Excellent. If religion is not about transformation, it will just be about transmission. It will hand on the garbage to the next generation. And it's about transforming your pain. And you have to have someone to give it to, or you'll give it on to somebody else. That's right. Which is the contemplative journey, where you go inside, you weep over it, you forgive it, you recognize it, right? And it's in you. It's not just in Germans and whoever else that you think is the problem. It's in me. And that we're all a part of this together. That's why Jesus becomes the Son of Man, the human one. He holds the human dilemma and becomes a part of the human dilemma instead of projecting the human dilemma, that it's your race that's the problem. It's your religion that's the problem. No, we're all the problem. Okay? You get it? It's the doctrine of the body of Christ, that we're all in this thing together. And we're all holding human evil inside of us, and we're also holding human holiness inside of us. And we're both. But we don't want to be just both. We want to get rid of the dark. Well, I better stop. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. It is rich stuff. I really know that. If you heard what I was saying at all today, you'll never look at the cross the same the rest of your life. And I will get over to your house sometime. We'll see.